So what we're here today to do is to kick off a series of discussions, a series of meetings to try to bring all of us up to speed on a complicated topic, and that is public school finance. Frankly, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of heat, a lot of noise on this topic, as there should be, but arguably less understanding of the issue than there needs to be for us to make any progress on this issue in this state. So this is our approach to kind of educating all of us together so that we're in a position to be informed participants in a debate that we think will be probably going somewhat in earnest in the upcoming legislative session, but probably won't come to a head until perhaps the next session. But Jimmy Don, we say that every year, don't we? Something like that? So we're honored today, and we'll have some other introductions in a minute. And Brenda, I didn't recognize you as a board member a minute ago. Nice to see you here as well, Brenda Hellier. I do want to recognize we have two members of the HISD school board, elected members of the school board, Sue Digert and Ann Sung here. So I want to thank you all for being here as well. You really have to look throughout this conversation, and you have to look like you already knew this. But perhaps none of us know it as well as we might. So thank you for being here, and appreciate that. Did Zeph Capo make the meeting? Zeph, of course, is head of the Houston Federation of Teachers, but he's elected onto the HCC board, a different topic, but hopefully Zeph will join us in a minute. Again, we'll introduce Jimmy Don Aycock, our speaker, in a minute. Hopefully we'll introduce Scott Hochberg in a minute, two former reps who are very, very knowledgeable on this subject. And I'm used to Scott kind of coming up here and giving this presentation, but he must have failed so miserably last time, Jimmy Don, that you were recruited. That's right. So let me give you my 2 cents. Clearly, public education is critical to the state, critical to this city. It's a critical issue to the partnership, public education. And that means public education for all, success for all, opportunity for all, a public education system that meets the needs of all Texans. That's our goal, right? That's our goal. But we often encounter this complex thing called public school finance. And everyone, it seems, is critical of public school finance. But when I press them a bit on what they're critical about, you know, sometimes it's as simple as, well, we ought to be putting more money into public school finance. And then my answer to those people is always, okay, tell me which tax you want me to raise. Because, you know, if you think there's a lot of fat in the Texas budget, frankly, you haven't been through a legislative session. I mean, you know, our legislative sessions, there's a lot of struggles to find the money for a lot of legitimate needs in this state. So a lot of times talking about increasing public school finance, you know, you at least have to be willing to acknowledge at some point what that means in terms of a source of revenue to do that. Or they'll say, I don't like the breakout between local school finance, where this local source of money, and the state source of money. And then I kind of say, well, all right, you know, you're a resident of the state and you're a resident of the city and the county. What is it that makes you prefer state funding over local funding? I'm just curious because, and if they know a lot about the subject, you realize this, the state is funded in a different way than local government is funded. So they may be making an argument that I would rather it be paid for with sales tax or franchise tax than property tax. But unless you're making that statement, we're all Texans and we're all, you know, whether it's local money or state money, at some point it still comes out of our pocket. But there are differences. Or they may be saying, the system is simply inequitable, that the amount of money afforded, let's say urban areas, is not commensurate with the true cost of providing education in urban areas. And that's an interesting topic, the rural-urban split in terms of how funding works. Or they may be saying disadvantaged kids, it can easily be shown that to achieve any kind of comparable outcomes with disadvantaged children, it takes more resources applied in a somewhat specific, unique way if you're going to get, you know, reasonable outcomes with disadvantaged kids. And so that they may be arguing for the fact that we really need to shift resources more specifically towards the areas of greatest needs. I say all this because, frankly, all of that gets captured in a subject of public school finance. This isn't simple. So when we talk about improving public school finance, we have to really understand how it works today, and then we have to be really thoughtful about what it would be that we would want to see change to make a better public school finance system. And I'm just hitting the tip of the iceberg. So I appreciate all of you being here today. to be part of this discussion. And it just begins a journey for all of us together in the coming months and perhaps years as we try to make these reforms happen. So with that, Andy, as you all know, Andy Waite is the chairman of the Education Advisory Committee. He's co-president at SCF Partners, a major private equity firm most of you are familiar with here in town. Andy took this on, and we said, with all due respect to Ann Sung and Sue Dygart, we kind of said, there are issues at HISD, but that's not what we want our Education Advisory Committee to focus on. We want you to focus on the strategic question of public school finance.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. So why are we as a partnership choosing to tackle public school finance? At the core of it, we have a fundamental belief that every child in Houston deserves a quality education and an opportunity for upward economic mobility. And a broken school finance system is clearly a major factor which prevents us from accomplishing those fundamental obligations. Current school outcomes and the lack of college and career-ready students who graduate from our public schools highlight the shortcomings of our current system. Just a few data points. In 2018, a study by the Dallas Federal Reserve, 70% of Texas business executives reported difficulty finding and hiring qualified workers. And just some very obvious examples, in the petrochemical and refining sector, where there's been a lot of construction activity, there was a real shortage of skilled technicians, welders, pipe fitters. In the Permian Basin today, there is a real challenge to find people who can engage in oil and gas activity in the region. So those are two examples. There are many more. And what's happening is this shortage of qualified personnel is increasing overall labor costs. 62% of the firms reporting having to increase wages and benefits in order to retain and attract qualified employees. And if you look at the Houston area, 50 to 60% of the jobs require training beyond high school, whether that's a certification, associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree. And so it really is one of our region's most pressing issues to find qualified workers for those middle skill positions that are vital to Houston's success. You know, when it comes to college degrees, today I believe 28% only of the state's graduating high school class achieve a graduate degree within 6 years of high school graduation. So I think for us, improving the school finance system is vital to increase career and college readiness of all of our students. It's got to be a top priority now, and we believe business leaders have a significant role to play in this conversation. So over the next few months, we will have experts like those that you'll hear from today share their knowledge on school finance so that we can raise our collective understanding of this issue and answer some of the foundational questions. How did we get where we are, and how does the current system actually function? And then through the work of a cohort of business leaders and the Partnership's Education Committee, we will try and define the business community's voice on public school finance. We'll try and identify areas and changes that we think we can advocate for and make a difference. And, you know, I'm very aware, as all of you are, that this is not the first attempt to improve the state's method of financing public education. And we're also, I think, realistic in that we may not see the fruits of our labor for many years, but it doesn't preclude us from trying to be the drivers of change. And speaking of driving change, we're really fortunate to have three people here today to speak to us who very much merit that title. So Jimmy Don Aycock, former chairman of the Texas House Committee on Public Education, he's going to give us an overview of the historical perspective on school finance and the current challenges we face in an attempt to change the way we fund our public schools. David Thompson, partner at Thompson & Horton, will explain public school funding and the state's role in that process. And Jennifer Esterline, Executive Director of Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Consortium, or we'll just say TGAC, will present school finance research that their organization has produced. So Chairman Aycock, I'd be delighted for you to come and address us.
Well, hello. Thank you for being interested. Ooh, where did the lights go? Thank you for being interested in this subject. Thank you for taking your time out today to come and talk some about school finance. As he said, my job is to give you about 15 or 20 minute background of the history and perspective of school finance and its role in Texas politics to some degree. It all started in 1836. 15 minutes may be a little short time to work with this. But in 1836, when we declared our independence from Mexico, part of the reason listed in that long list of grievances was that Mexico was not funding schools, had no provision for public schools, and it outraged the public. And the public in Texas has largely been outraged about school finance ever since. We come to 1949, baby boomers. Along comes Gilmer Aiken and the state's commitment to fund Texas students in a public education setting. It was the foundational block for school finance. We come to 1984, House Bill 72. We decided that we not only want to fund it, we want to monitor the outcomes and begin this testing regimen that began. We began measuring success, measuring outcomes. The reason I'm talking about history is that's where I came in. I was on the school board when we tried to implement HB 72. It goes back that far. We come to 1995 and SB 1 opened up a second path called charter schools. So now we have not only the traditional public school setting, we have a public school called a charter school. And so those also share in the economic complexities of our funding system. Consistently over the years, for many years, bills about schools and school financing have been the largest number of bills filed in the legislature virtually every session for many years. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of bills filed about public education. It involves about half the state budget. Article 3, we call it, which is both higher education and public education, constitutes well over half the state budget. So it's a huge part of your tax revenue that goes to the state. It is the largest single section of the budget. And then there's these lawsuits that keep coming up. David's been involved in several of them. Have you been involved in all 7? Pretty much, yeah. Series of lawsuits that have regulated part of the constraints that face your legislature. So why is it so darn hard to fix public education? Everybody says, well, why don't the legislature just fix it? I see you smile, Scott. Been there, done that. We've tried, haven't we? There are a number of things that add to this complexity that you need to understand as fundamental to the environment that the legislature works in. First, there's this pesky concept in the Constitution that says the state shall provide a free and efficient system of public schools. Free and efficient public schools. It's in the Constitution. And then they come along behind that and say, oh, by the way, you can't do it with a statewide property tax because that's unconstitutional. And they follow that with another concept that says that you can't fund it with state income tax. So immediately you see the constraints begin to push the the funding toward the property tax issue that's so complex. Here come the courts and say that there's this concept that in order to be efficient, it has to be at least somewhat equitable. So we get into the relative equity of one student in one part of the state or one city and how they relate funding-wise to students in other parts of the state. And then they complicate it even farther and say that if we have one rate of property tax statewide, that it constitutes a de facto state property tax. So there has to be variety within your property taxing. Do you see the complexities that begin to enter into the discussion? It's not a simple deal. Now let's move to the demographics. For recent years and recent biennium, Texas has been growing about 80,000 students per session, or per year rather. We believe that in the coming years, that has been reduced significantly. Probably realistic numbers about 40,000 students a year. That's still a lot of new students. And all those students will require new funding. For many of us in this room, we grew up in a different world. The state is now a very different demographic than it was when I was a child in elementary school or high school. We have about 60% poor students. 60%, most people say it's closer to 62 now, that are in the free and reduced lunch category. We have over half of our students that are now Hispanic. We have only about 28% of our students that are Anglo. Wow. That's a different world than I grew up in, and most of you grew up in a different world. So the challenges facing our schools are very different than they were in years gone by. Most of you in here have a connection to the Houston economy. Your economy is vastly different than Terlingua, Texas. Your economy is vastly different than Lubbock, Texas. The high-tech needs of Austin, Texas are very different than your needs. I think the first thing that struck me when I began working on this in the legislature was just how different the job demands, the tax issues, the property value issues, just how different it was from place to place over those 1,000+ districts in the state of Texas. It's a striking difference in what we need, and the answers that have to be given for a statewide system do not always fit well with the local needs of individual communities. Then we get into tax policy issues. If you think it got complicated with demographics and constitution and court cases, tax policy is driving the discussion about school finance right now. We have this system where, as David will explain later, the state has a responsibility for part of it, locals have a responsibility for part of it, feds have a responsibility for part of it, and that's different from place to place to place. Houston is now in this lowly situation of sending money to the state, which I know you all love. Austin now sends 53% of their tax revenue to the state of Texas. Dallas has fallen into the situation of sending money to the state of Texas. When the concept of Robin Hood was first formed as a tax policy, it was inconceivable that the large urban areas would become what we call Chapter 41 districts and be sending money to the state of Texas. I think it was less than 10% of the students involved at the time. Just a handful of outliers that had huge taxable wealth per student. And nobody ever dreamed that this situation would arise. And yet years later, here we are. So we're complicated by constitution, by court cases, by tax policy, by demographics. It's not a simple issue, people. So what actually works in this system? Let's talk about the things that we know seem to be working. Attracting, training, and retaining teachers is the key ingredient that we must address. And it will not get addressed very quickly because our teacher attraction and retention is not doing particularly well right now. It's very difficult to attract bright, young, aggressive students into that cadre of young teachers. One of the most disturbing discussions I had while I chaired Public Education Committee occurred over in East Texas. A group of about 12 or 15 superintendents, all small school superintendents. Closed door, no press, nobody around. Said they just wanted warm bodies with a certificate to fill their teaching slots. Quality was desired. They longed for quality teachers, but they couldn't find the teachers to fill those slots. The urban areas are in a little better shape than that, but those people that live out in West Texas, East Texas, small rural Texas communities are struggling mightily to attract, train, and retain quality teachers because they just want to move into the urban areas by and large. Second thing that's working, sending our strongest, best teachers to the areas where we need them the most, and Houston is a good example of that. You have some schools that are just knocking a home run every year. You have other schools that have been in problems for years and years and years. And sending our most difficult schools the best teachers is an answer that we've got to figure out how to do it. A program in Dallas called ACE seems to be working. The ACE program stimulates those teachers to go for several years to those hardest schools and compensates them handily to go turn those schools around. The ACE program has shown great results in Dallas. There's a problem. The ACE program is not financially sustainable in Dallas, and it's probably not financially sustainable in any city in the state of Texas unless we add funds to it. It will be a very hotly debated topic this coming session because it's one of the target issues of sending our best teachers to the hardest places. The other thing that seems to be working, and this one is very controversial, is early childhood education. Finding the resources for full day, formula funded pre-K for those hardest communities has to become a priority. Unless we catch those most difficult demographic students up early, and I mean catch them up early, they'll come to third grade, not be reading on level. And we know from multitudes of data that unless a child is reading on grade level, by grade 3, it will be difficult and in some cases nearly impossible to remediate that child within a reasonable time and expenditure. We must catch those most difficult demographic students up early. We must catch them up aggressively. We must have them reading on grade level by the end of grade 3, because in grade 4, they must begin reading for learning. Unless they can read to learn by that time, the difficulty of remediation becomes almost insurmountable. Fourth thing that's working, it's even more controversial, and it's taking place in a couple of schools in Austin. Waco is trying it now. It's the thought of combined services, where you engage the entire community around these most difficult schools, provide health care, counseling, nutrition, all kinds of social services for these difficult demographic areas. Now, you talk about something that's controversial. That will resonate the controversy of the legislature like nothing else, because they say, why should I take money from the kids that are in nice homes and nice families and devote those resources to the more troubled population? It's a resonant discussion within the legislature. So all of this comes together in urban areas, but also comes together in rural areas. But remember that your problems here in Houston are significantly different than the small school problems. Whether you send money or get money from the state, it looks very different at times. All of these programs I've talked about will cost money. Right now there's a commission. I was on the last commission. Thank goodness I'm not on this one. But they've been meeting all year long, trying to find things that work, trying to find things that can be funded, trying to find, hopefully very shortly, your Senator Betancourt will come up with a work group that's going to say we have lots of revenue. Maybe not, I don't know. You're smiling. Unless we come up with some revenue somewhere, meeting these strategies will be almost impossible. So as you begin this process over the next few months of thinking about how do we fund schools, part of that discussion needs to be efficiency. Part of it needs to be what works. Part of it needs to be how do we get the money? We're going all over the state trying to stimulate this discussion. I applaud your organization for your attempts to start this discussion within your community as you talk to your friends and coworkers and fellow folks. Engage in a thoughtful, productive discussion of what can be done. Not just, I want my taxes cut, or I want my taxes raised, or I want more money for teachers, or I want more of this or less of that. You got to think it through. It is not an easy subject. So be patient, be productive, be conversant, be active. Support those who support public schools. It is our future. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. How many of you, like me, were listening or watching to the other important hearing going on today? I'm going to catch up later on in the afternoon. Obviously important subjects for our whole country. Thanks very much to the partnership and to our sponsors for this event. And thanks so much to many of you who have continued to work on this issue for so many years. And just the level of support and interest that we have here in Houston is really something that we should be proud of. And I particularly want to acknowledge the members of the HISD board. I know we've been joined. Wanda, thank you for being here, and Sue and Ian. And we have former board members, Anna and Diane. Thank y'all. Many of you who have been at board meetings know how many hours. I think we counted a couple years ago, and y'all put in about 2,000 hours a year that is completely unpaid work for serving on a school board. So thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about school finance, and years ago, one of my friends and sort of one of my mentors, Mark Udolph, who was my favorite professor in law school, went on to be chancellor of UT and chancellor of the California college system. But as a young college professor, his focus was on school finance. And he once observed that school finance is sort of like a Russian novel. It's dark and dreary, and at the end, everyone dies. We want to avoid that particular outcome, and sharing some information I hope can help us get there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the structure of school finance and some of the key policy issues, a little bit where we could focus. And I have a few thoughts on the revenue issue, because at the end of the day, this does come down to where are some meaningful ways to get some dollars to invest in our schools. Think of 3 policy questions around school finance. First question, pretty simple. What are we trying to accomplish? If this was 100 years ago and our goal was to educate some of the kids to a pretty low-level standard, the honest response would be, that doesn't maybe take a lot of money. Fortunately today, we've spent a fair amount of time in Texas focusing on standards. Our standards and our expectations are for all children to graduate from high school, college, or career ready for that next meaningful step to becoming a productive adult. That's a high standard. This is the first year in Texas that we're doing A through F ratings for schools, and in the way of transparency, I think it's appropriate to give the state grades. I think the state probably gets, with a lot of the work done, by the way, by Chairman Aycock and Scott, when you were in the legislature, I think we get a pretty solid A- on our standards. We've got good standards. Second policy question. What does it take to accomplish those standards? Is there a connection between what we think we want to accomplish and what's it going to take to get there? In terms of qualified teachers, which Chairman Aycock has spoken to, technology, support, food service, transportation, safe buildings, what does it take? And then the third question, how are we going to divide that up? What part are we going to look to local communities to carry? And what part really should be a state responsibility that the state, looking at the entire tax base and all of the different activities in the state, should be responsible for? I think by the time we get to that question, we have to actually acknowledge that our state gets a pretty solid F. And that's not just my opinion. National studies that look across states say Texas policy around funding schools is a D or an F. And there are so many issues we could talk about, but in a short period of time, we do have inequities. We have differences in funding levels between schools in areas of the state that some of them make sense, some of them really don't make sense. We have outdated formulas. We have many formulas that I sometimes say were last touched and updated when Ronald Reagan was president. The Berlin Wall was standing and Merle Haggard had the #1 song. And if that's not your musical genre, in 1984, Van Halen's #1 song was Jump. We have school finance formulas that haven't been updated since Jump was the #1 song. Now, how many of you would run your computer for your business or your home on software that you haven't updated since the 1990s? It is ridiculous. There is no excuse, and I am tired of excuses for why we haven't kept our system for funding schools more up to date. But now let's talk about funding. Do a little demo. Here I think is the simple biggest issue we need to focus on, because it's going to drive how we address some of the issues about equity, about updating formulas, about meeting higher standards. And that is this issue of a declining state share. And I want you to think about how our school funding system works. The formulas are complicated, but in the end, they're not that complicated. There's probably nothing in our system that rises above Algebra 2. Maybe the CEI gets into a little bit of statistics, maybe a lot of statistics, but most of our formulas are pretty straightforward math. The interactions of them can sometimes produce unexpected or unintended results, and again, the key issue is they're out of date. But we start in Texas with a basic amount. We'll call it a basic allotment. That's an original term. And then we make some adjustments to that, and we make two basic types of adjustments. One set of adjustments are for student characteristics. If a kid comes from a low income background is an English language learner, may need special education services. There are some adjustments to reflect student characteristics. And then there are some adjustments to reflect district characteristics. Like if you're in a very small, sparse area of the state, like Chairman Aycock has already mentioned, or the CEI, which hadn't been updated since '91, that is supposed to take into consideration kind of the cost of living issues, particularly in areas like Houston and other metropolitan areas. We run all of these adjustments through formulas, and I want you to think about this cup as being a district's total entitlement. So we start with a basic allotment, we do our adjustments, formulas could certainly be updated, but we get a cup that is a total adjustment or the total amount, and let's say this is Houston ISD. Now the state does not start off by saying, well great, we'll put our state money in to help fund education. The state looks at a local community and says, well, how much can you fill out of the cup with local property taxes? That's where we start. Is what can you bear? What can you carry locally? Now, a community that might not be very wealthy maybe only puts a little bit into the cup, and then the state says, okay, then we'll top off and fill the rest of the cup. Another community might be able to fill more of the cup with local tax dollars, and then the state says, okay, so it doesn't take quite as much state money to top it off. And then you have this concept of recapture, and all that is communities that have so much property wealth that we not only fill the glass completely full with local money, it flows over. And the part that flows over goes back to the state into general revenue, is typically how that works. Now, here's the key policy question. What happens when values go up locally? I know what's happened with our home. Frankly, sometimes I grimace a little bit, but I work with districts all over the state. I've been all over the state. I would much rather live in an area where there's a lot of economic activity and values are rising than to be in areas where there are falling values and there's not much going on economically. I will take our problems over those problems. What happens when values go up, which we're all going to deal with here because we're in taxing season? Does the glass get bigger? No. The state formulas simply say, oh great, your values went up so you can fill more of your glass locally. That means we just get to put in less state money. It frees up state money to be spent elsewhere in the budget, not just in education, but literally outside of education. That is why the comptroller actually identifies rising local property values as one of the key revenue sources for the state of Texas. And in fact, if the state were transparent on tax policy, local property taxes are one of the 5 largest tax sources that the state depends on to fund the General Appropriations Act. I want you to think about that, and I'll show you some data on it. Here's a quick slide that shows the declining state share over time. The dark blue bar is the part we're paying out of local property taxes. The light blue bar is the declining state share to pay for public education. And that is simply taking this mechanism that I just described, where when values go up, the state frees up state money, puts less state money into public education, and then frees those dollars up to be spent elsewhere in the budget. Here is a chart showing actual numbers. The first couple of lines, I want you to note that if you look over a number of years, the total amount that we're spending per student in Texas is relatively flat. But if you look at the next couple of lines, what you will see is the mix has shifted dramatically. We're paying much more of the load, and this is statewide, and it may be even more extreme in some communities like Houston. We're paying more of the load out of local property taxes, less out of the state. And then I want you to look at the bottom line. If we simply adjusted our funding for public education by the state CPI, we're actually spending less today on public schools than we spent a decade ago. That's in spite of rising standards, changing demographics, some of the other issues that we know are that we're dealing with in our schools. If we take that simple inflation adjustment, we're actually spending less in real dollars. But even without looking at that, if you look at the other dollars, you'll see a flat overall funding, but a significant decline in the local share. In the state share. Just to comment about recapture, because this is increasingly a bigger issue, as Chairman Aycock observed. Recapture originated as a mechanism to deal with a very small number of aberrational, very high wealth districts that were just frankly skewing all of the analysis. And you'll note the first year we had recapture, we were dealing with, I think, 30 some odd districts and 130 some odd $1 million. Well, the state figured out over the years, this could actually be a revenue source. And you'll note in the current biennium, we actually have 200 districts that are paying recapture, and we're right at $5 billion. We've gone from 131 million to $5 billion. Austin pays $600 million a year of local property taxes. These are taxes that people pay to their schools thinking it benefits public education or simply being sent to Austin. Our recapture here in Houston is up to what this year? Renee? 272 million. What's it going to be next year? Over 300 million next year. Dallas is having an election on November 6th that they are now tipping into recapture. Chairman Aycock's observation, this wasn't the concept and intent originally is dead on, but it is the consequence, it is the inexorable consequence, don't you like that word? Of gradually stripping state dollars out of public schools every year over an extended period of time and shifting costs to local property taxes. If we continue on the path we're on, if we had the same conversation 2 years from now, we would have well over 300 districts that are in recapture, and this number would be more in the range of 7.5 to 8 billion. That's how significant these issues are of the state shifting. You will note the recapture is much larger than the lottery. It's actually quite a bit larger than the distribution from the Permanent School Fund, which is our constitutional fund to help pay for education, and it has continued to grow over the years. It is simply the consequence of a state system that is using local property taxes as a hidden source of revenue to fund state government. Now, if the state had simply kept its share constant over the last 10 years, Houston would not be in recapture. Those 272 million property tax dollars would be used locally either to improve our schools or to lower taxes or some combination. So just a word to think about. This is an issue I want to focus on because this issue is making it so difficult to address other issues. It's hard to update formulas that are decades old unless you have some money to do it. It's hard to raise the size of the glass to meet higher standards for a growing population of needy kids. if we're going to keep stripping all of the local property taxes out and use it to subsidize state performance. Now, a little bit about where we might want to look for some revenue sources. And these are just some thoughts, a little bit of a look at state revenue. We are, our largest that we're very dependent on is the sales tax. You'll note that it's grown quite a bit more than estimate. We had an event a year ago, Harvey. That actually probably translated into sales tax growth. We had a lot more refrigerators, washing machines, mattresses, sofas bought than we were thinking we were going to have. You'll note that our motor vehicle tax is a little down, but pretty close to the estimate. The big shift is in the oil and gas severance taxes, and you just look how much those are overperforming what was estimated back at the time. Our taxes on alcohol and cigarettes are pretty close to where they were estimated, maybe even down a little bit. And then the motor fuels tax is a little up from what it was estimated, but not a huge variance. A couple of things I think we need to think about, because as we talk about some of these issues in school funding, the response we sometimes get is, well, I agree with you, but gosh, where are we going to get money? I view that as an unwillingness to actually deal with the issue, and probably not the best response. There was a U.S. Supreme Court decision in June of this year, the South Carolina versus Wayfair decision that reversed a 1992 decision that predated the internet. How many of us remember back in the early 90s when there was no such thing as online purchases? There were catalog purchases. Do you remember you'd get your Lands End catalog or whatever, and you know, and you might even send in through the mail an actual paper order? How many of us sitting at home in the evening, maybe in our pajamas, in the last 6 months has bought something online? It's fastest growing segment of our overall sales tax or sales activity. This 1992 decision had said unless a business had a physical presence, a brick and mortar presence in a state could not subject all of those sales to sales taxes. Now remember, that predated internet, and so the Supreme Court actually reconsidered it in a case this year. 41 states, including Texas, filed an amicus brief asking the Supreme Court to reconsider, and the Supreme Court in fact did so. And they've now kind of, I would say, updated their legal conception and said that virtual presence is sufficient for a state to treat online sales the way we're already treating our brick and mortar businesses that are in our state. That alone, if we could implement it in Texas, is going to generate well over $1 billion a year of additional sales tax without raising a nickel on any physical business that's already collecting sales tax in the state. We need to do that. We need to dedicate it to education. A second observation, and I know Chairman Aycock, you raised this a number of years ago. We need to honestly look at our motor fuels tax, our gasoline tax. We have one of the lower taxes in the country. It helps support transportation, highway funding. Texas is a growing state. We talk about growth in schools. We're adding over 420,000 residents a year. Feels like they're all here some days. That creates issues for schools, but also for water, electric grid, transportation, etc. And we need to be responsible and think as a growing state and look at some of these revenue sources. Couple of observations about where we're going into the next session. TEA recently presented its legislative appropriations request, or LAR, to really start the appropriations process for the next cycle. And in fairness to the commissioner, I want to make clear, they have to take the law as it currently exists. They're making a request that is premised on an existing legal framework. I want you to know what their request contemplates, because it is the way the current system works. If we don't address this issue of state share and the state stripping out property taxes, state funding for education is going to actually decline by $3.5 billion next biennium over this biennium. How could that be? Because that's another $3.5 billion that will be shifted to local property taxes. And that's what the commissioner's recommendation literally just said. And he acknowledged that in questions before the legislative budget board. So I think this is a key issue. If we don't address it, then our ability to address other issues, to update formulas, to meet the needs of our needier children, gets very difficult. One last observation that is particularly important here on the Gulf Coast. That's Hurricane Harvey, a little over a year ago. By the time we're in the legislative session in spring of 2019, Harvey will be a year and a half in the rearview mirror. And more importantly, it'll be after an election. And my experience is political memories tend to get short after elections. The state still has not appropriated funds to help school districts recover from Harvey. This is an issue for every district from Rockport to the Louisiana coast border. And we need a one-time funding, probably in the range of $2 billion out of the rainy day fund, because Harvey was a rainy day. It was several rainy days. We need one-time funding to assist with that recovery from Harvey, and that is a priority that we particularly need to keep on our minds and talk about in this area. Just a couple of other things, and this is not school funding, but it sort of relates. We just got our first round of A through F ratings. I thought I would let you see what the distribution is statewide among districts between A's and F's. Both for traditional school districts and charter schools. Here's something I really want you to see. It's a scattergram that basically shows the relationship between A through F ratings and concentrations of low-income kids. And what you see is high correlation. In other words, our A through F rating system isn't really measuring how hard teachers are working, how much schools may be accomplishing. What we're almost measuring is where are our concentrations of low-income kids. And I have another slide I should have brought today. If you overlay low-income population with mobility, kids who move around during a school year, this relationship becomes even stronger. Our schools do pretty well with kids that are in one place throughout a school year. We struggle with kids who not only come from poor backgrounds, but who move during the year. You can see the same thing if we look at other national measures. You'll see a correlation of performance on like SAT and ACT between low-income and non-low-income status. And this will just give you a sense of the growth of the percent of our population in Texas that actually are low-income. Chairman Aycock alluded to this. And roughly 60% of our kids statewide, I think over 80% of our kids here in Houston, do come from low-income homes. Obviously, we have the same high expectations and needs for those kids to secure great educations and be able to go on and become productive, successful Texans in the future. I'm very much in favor of that. As I get older, I'm even more in favor of it. So these relationships are real, they're strong. Our funding system really doesn't account for this right now. Remember, we have formulas that we haven't touched since the 80s and 90s. I regard that as inexcusable. Chairman Aycock did a great effort 2 sessions ago attempting to update it. Thank you very much. And I don't think you found a willing partner on the other side of the rotunda, but we'll keep working on that. So this is an overview, but think about that one issue. If we address that, then we create some capacity to begin to address some of the other issues that we know we need to take care of in our schools. I want to say, as a parent, as a taxpayer, as a resident in Houston ISD, I'm very appreciative of public education, and particularly very appreciative of Houston ISD. Our kids both went through the public schools here in Houston ISD, and largely because of the experience that they had with great teachers in our public schools here, both of our daughters are now public school teachers. I couldn't get either one of them interested in being a lawyer. They had higher aspirations. Thanks for the work that we're all doing together here, not only in Houston ISD, but frankly in our larger metropolitan area. We need to stay engaged. It's so critical not only for our economy, but really for our democracy and our society. These problems are fixable. They're not fixable overnight, but they are fixable. If we had simply indexed 10 years ago the basic allotment, remember that number we start with, so that it grew as local property values grew. If we had simply done that, if property values go up 5%, the basic allotment goes up 5%. That's just a little bit, but it's almost like compound interest. Today, recapture would be less than half of what it is. Houston would not even be in recapture. We would have more dollars to spend in our schools. We would be able to maybe take a little pressure off local property taxes. And we would address many other issues that we have. So what we need are not sitcom solutions where we think we fixed it and then we forget about it in 28 minutes. We need sustained long-term effort and commitment, but I think we can do it. And I look forward to working with our schools, with HISD, with all of our districts, and with our great business community here in the Gulf Coast. Thank you.
Can I get a round of applause for all of our speakers? Well, thank you again for everybody being here today. I hope you'll agree this was an excellent way to kick off our school finance focus. I think we've all learned a lot here today, and I think there will be very useful information that we can build upon as we work through this issue. So our next meeting is on October 11th here from 2 to 3:30. We will have Cheryl Pace from the Texas Taxpayers and Research Association, and she will give us a deeper dive into some of the formulas that were mentioned here today, and we'll send an invitation out on that. But again, thank you everybody for being here. I'm excited to be working with you all and hope that we can achieve great things together. Thank you.